We're incredibly lucky to have these expert commentators with us today to help us get to grips with the coming election. Each of them is insightful, eloquent, and utterly charming. So I've asked each of them to speak for about 7 minutes or so. Tim will concentrate on Labour, Miranda on the Lib Dems, and Janan on the Conservatives. And they'll outline their analysis of where the election is and also where the post-election landscape might head.
You'll be told that this election is the closest and most important for a generation, and I think that is only half correct. I don't think it's the most important. I think 2010 was more important because it determined what our fiscal policy was going to be at a time when our deficit was 11% of GDP and the markets, at least on the continent, were a little bit skittish. Whereas this election determines what our fiscal policy is going to be at a time when the deficit is, 5% of GDP, and the markets are much more relaxed. So it matters hugely as an election, but I think it's less of a fork in the road than 2010 was. But it is the closest election since 1974, when we had two in the same year. And the way I would put it is that it's the first election in my lifetime where 3 weeks out, we don't know who's going to win. Now, some of you will cite 1992 as another example, but in 1992, 3 weeks out, we knew Labour were going to win. We were wrong, but we had someone on this panel 23 years ago at this time would have hazarded a guess in a way that none of us really can, and it seemed that Labour would win. So it's the closest election since 1974. And the question that I keep getting asked from people looking at Britain from the outside is, why is the election as close as it is? From their perspective, not from mine, but from their perspective, they see a prime minister who is reasonably respected, an economy which is in its third year of recovery, low unemployment, low inflation, and the rest of it. Surely this adds up to a pretty comfortable victory for the incumbents. And I think the analytic mistake that they make, and that the Conservative Party makes, is assuming that there are only two fundamentals in politics: leadership and the economy. And if that were true, then the election would already be over. The Conservatives would be heading for an overall majority. But there is a third fundamental, which is this thing that we've come to call your party's brand or reputation. And brand is a smarmy sounding word for something that's actually quite serious and substantial and shifts a lot of votes. So how is your party perceived in the country? Do people identify with its values or its perceived values? Do they think it's on their side and populated by people who are like them? And on that score, Labour are insurmountably ahead, and the Conservatives have the same, as bad a problem of brand toxicity as they've had for the past 20 years. So this is not an election between a popular leader with strong economic credentials versus an unpopular leader with bad economic credentials. It's a contest between an unpopular party with a popular leader and strong economic credentials versus a popular party with an unpopular leader and weak economic credentials. So the score is not 2-0, it's 2-1. This question of brand sort of feeds into what happens post-election, not in the subsequent weeks, but in the subsequent years. The single biggest challenge for the Conservative Party is, how do they finally fix this radioactive reputation they have in the north of England, or at least the northern cities of England, Scotland, Wales, even London now, where it's seen as countercultural to vote Tory. And I'll close by just saying one thing, which is that I have quite a reductionist view of politics, which is that the only thing that ever works, that really shifts votes and on a lasting basis, is when you surprise people, when you say things that are counter to what they expect you as a party to say. And you can surprise people in various ways. You can choose a leader who is very unlike your party, or the other thing is policy, coming up with shockingly counterintuitive policies. And I always wonder what would have happened in recent years had the Conservatives proposed a higher inheritance tax and used the money to spend more on the NHS, or cut the standard rate of income tax, or build more houses, or whatever. Something that absolutely grabs people by the lapels and says, we are not who you think we are, we're this. The reason this election is as close as it is also linked to the Conservatives' biggest mission between 2015 and 2020, which is not how do you cobble together a coalition or any of the technical stuff we'll discuss, but how do you get to a stage where people with right of centre views in Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow do not regard it as perverse to vote for your party?
It seems to me this idea of is it a real fork in the road or not, it's very, very interesting actually, because certainly I would agree that, in terms of fiscal policy, that's now set. The Labour Party, even at their manifesto launch this week, was having to make huge efforts to reassure people that they had also got the message on fiscal rectitude. But actually, I think it is a genuine fork in the road this time for different underlying reasons, more to do with party politics and how it works in this country. And I think, clearly for the last 5 years, we've lived through this intriguing experiment, as I think another commentator called it, of the first peacetime coalition for 60 years. And I think it's fair to say that it's been proven that it works and can provide stable, strong government, whether you agree with it or not. But we haven't yet embarked on a different sort of experiment, which is to see whether a coalition that's not of two parties could work. And there's a huge question mark over whether it could. And also, because of the Scottish referendum, we're living through this period where we're watching a huge chunk of our territory and a huge chunk of our population ask themselves whether they want to be part of us anymore. And, of course, in the end, the Scots voted no and they voted to stay, probably for those sensible, fundamental economic reasons that Janan would argue are the basis of all politics. But there is something going on there, and clearly the toothpaste's not going back in the tube anytime soon. The referendum has far from settled the issue. The extraordinary thing about this election campaign is the rise of the SNP, who will, may well be the main factor depriving the Labour Party of a majority. And also the knock-on from that could not just sort of be affecting what we do about devolution of power to Scotland and Wales, for example, but is already set in train this enormous question about what we do about how England is governed even. So actually I think it is a fork in the road because of these questions of governance and also consent, actually, because people are fed up. I mean, they're deeply, deeply fed up, and maybe some of us have been doing a little bit of on the ground, either reporting or campaigning. And actually, there is a huge gulf now between the governors and the governed, the electors and the elected. And so we are going to have to sort of address that as well. So I think there is a big fork in the road, and people have written a lot. I've written about it myself, so has Janan, about this fracturing, that in the 50s, 97% of people either voted for Conservatives or Labour. Now we've got the two parties deadlocked at about 33% each. But we've got the rise of these parties on each extreme, the left and the right. We've got this resurgence of nationalism. It is a kind of picture in flux. And it's going to be really fascinating to see where, how it all resolves itself. Because even if some sort of government that can function is cobbled together, all of these fundamental shifts in the tectonic plates of how our politics works are still going on, and they'll still have to be dealt with. So I think it is actually really quite a moment. Just to talk sort of briefly about the kind of Lib Dem issue, whatever other people thought of them, they always enjoyed seeing themselves as on the sort of Cavalier versus Roundhead side, because they were outside the system. And now, because of joining government, they've firmly had to join the Roundhead side. And this intriguing experiment of trying to provide stable government through a coalition, okay, they can claim that it's worked. One thing we've also learned about it is that it is really electorally toxic for the junior party. So they're having to grapple with that, and they're having to try and make a virtue out of being Roundheads, not Cavaliers. And it sits very, very badly with the sort of people who would traditionally vote Lib Dem, and even with themselves. So it's difficult for them to do. It's very difficult for them to convincingly say, vote for us, we're the sensible party, when they quite like to still be the radicals. So there's a kind of nostalgia that they're fighting with there. And I think, if any of you saw Nick Clegg launching his manifesto, he had to stand there with his manifesto, which is actually a really lovely document with lots of really good policies in it, and say, this is an insurance policy. So Lib Dem doorstep canvassers have literally become self-described door-to-door salesman for an insurance policy, which is unglamorous in the extreme. And so how they get themselves out of this, their own branding dilemma, which is very different from the Tory branding dilemma, but it is one for them. How they deal with that after the election, whether they're in or out of power, I think is a big issue for the Lib Dems.
I thought I'd talk a little bit about two possible scenarios, actually. The first one being if Labour makes it into government, and then the second one being if Labour loses. Janan, I think he'd say, isn't too optimistic about the chances of an effective Labour government. And I'd have to agree with him that it is going to be euphemistically tough if Labour win. I'm not sure, however, that it's going to be catastrophic for a number of reasons. The first is that while and we have seen this a little bit from rumblings that have gone over the last 2 weeks, there is clearly still a left in the Labour Party. It's not that big, and I don't think it's any more of a problem than the right in the Conservative Party. In fact, it's probably less of a problem for any Labour Prime Minister. I think there will be some huffing and there will be some puffing, but I doubt very much whether people like John McDonnell or his colleagues will actually blow the house down. If we look at what's happened in previous Labour governments, actually a small majority can often instill a degree of discipline that you don't see when you have a Labour government with a very, very big majority. Harold Wilson was famously caught playing golf in the corridors of Chequers by someone, and somebody said, "How's your handicap, Harold?" This was after the 1966 election, which he won very well, and he said it's gone up from 4 to 97. And I think there is something to that. And there's something also to the fact that Ed Miliband is not David Cameron, in the sense that I think he is actually quite an emollient people manager, and he might be able to do a slightly better job than David Cameron of making people feel more involved and less neglected. Now, clearly there are going to have to be cuts, and that's going to be a problem for any social democratic party. However, having said that, there are also going to be tax rises. Labour, of course, are not talking about those, and they've agreed to rule out various obvious possibilities. But we know that after almost every single general election, that the government will bring in some kind of revenue-raising measures. I don't know what they're going to be. I mean, at a guess, it might be revaluation of council tax bans, for example. It might be merging national insurance and tax and therefore putting up rates through the back door that way. It might be some sort of hypothecation for NHS funding. But I would say, pound to a penny, appositely, there will be tax rises, which means perhaps there will be fewer cuts than perhaps some people think. Clearly, we're also dealing with a bunch of politicians who are not neophytes. Most of the Labour people who will go into government have already been in government. Now, clearly, in much easier times, at least up until 2008, but they do know what it's like to govern. They've also seen the alternative over the last 5 years and haven't liked it very much, which I think may actually instill a degree of discipline. And you can argue that actually, although it's easy to talk about the Brown-Blair years as conflictual, etc., there is a sort of discipline and a professionalism, believe it or not, still around Labour, which is a legacy of the new Labour years. And also that Labour will almost certainly go into government, if they go into government, I think, with the Lib Dems. And the Lib Dem presence provides Labour perhaps with an excuse, perhaps with cover, perhaps with an insurance policy for making some of the cuts that they will need to make. The big problem, obviously, will be the SNP, with its anti-austerity agenda. To call that a tricky relationship is an understatement. But the SNP also have to be careful, I think, that they don't destabilise things so much that they seem to bring down a government. So what would social democracy look like in that case? It's very difficult to tell, I think. We haven't really got many available models for what social democracy looks like in hard times. Certainly very successful models. France isn't a good one to look at. Denmark isn't a particularly good one to look at either. In both cases, those parties got realistic and got less popular as a result. I think if we want to look to any examples, it may be Germany, which is, of course, a Christian democratic government, albeit with a social democratic grand coalition element to it. But that wouldn't be that surprising given Ed's natural affinity, if you like, with the kind of German model of capitalism. I suspect that social democracy after this election will be what a Labour government does. I think there'll be a degree of inconsistency, there'll be a degree of muddling through, there'll be a degree of what counts is what works. But that's no different from George Osborne and David Cameron, really, if you look at the last 5 years. So that's that scenario. The other scenario is Labour loses. In that case, I think Miliband goes. Even if he makes it through the summer, I would assume there'll be a challenge in the autumn and he would be replaced. Will that make an ideological difference who wins? I'm not so sure, actually, because while what people do in the campaign to win the leadership obviously constrains what they do afterwards, and that's been true of Ed Miliband, I think, in the way that he tried to distance himself from New Labour and therefore has had difficulty kind of reclaiming some of the achievements of New Labour for Labour as it is now. They don't have to completely constrain what a new leader does. And anyway, all of them will pay lip service to decentralisation, to fiscal credibility, to unity. I don't think what will happen will be some sort of blue Labour takeover, despite what some people in the House of Lords, in the Labour Party, would like to imagine, nor do I think that the empire, i.e. New Labour, will strike back in any big way. I think what we'll see is a kind of amalgam in a best case scenario, or a fudge in the worst case scenario, between those two strands. And then the Labour Party is going to have to think, and I'd urge you to think about really, what policy have they come up with in the last 5 years that has been such a disaster that they need to dump it? What didn't Labour do, or what hasn't Labour done that it needs to do next time around? If Labour's sensible, then it will just simply try and make a better fist of persuading the public about where it actually is. And where it actually is where it probably was for a lot of the New Labour period, really. It's the ambition to combine kind of economic dynamism with social justice, and it's a tendency to try and get as near to public opinion on issues like immigration and law and order as it's possible for a kind of progressive liberal party to get. Clearly, one thing Labour will have to do is rebuild its relationship, at least at the rhetorical level, with business. That's going to be, I think, a big ask for the next Labour leader. And what Labour should do is focus its attack on the next Conservative government, if there is one, not on its cruelty, as it seemed to do for so much of the last 5 years, but on its competence. And there's a big kind of missing chunk, I think, of the Labour Party's job in opposition that it hasn't done that well, and it could do much better next time around. And then it also has to decide what it does about Scotland. What it may do, but what I think it shouldn't do, is see the whole thing as an existential crisis for social democracy, because I think social democracy in the 21st century is pretty hard to define anyway. The other thing that the Labour Party is going to have to come to terms with, and it's something that the Tories are going to have to come to terms with, something that the Liberal Democrats are very familiar with, I'm not sure we're ever going to get back to a politics where the Labour Party, like the Conservative Party, is going to be able to get over 40% again. And it's how these two big parties adjust to that I think will be the most interesting thing.